I think we've got critical mass, so we'll get started. Welcome everyone to the Michigan, thanks, Sarah. Welcome everyone to the Spring 2021 meeting of the Michigan Women in Sports Task Force. This is actually our last virtual meeting because the Open Meetings Act allows us to have virtual meetings through the end of this month. And then we are meeting in person. We'll have a virtual component as well, but our subsequent meetings will be back in person. And so glad to see everyone healthy and emerging out of the moment we've just gone through. And we've got an exciting forward progress agenda today. And it looks like we've got a full house as well. So so we'll get started, and we'll start by doing a roll call of everyone here, both our members and our advisory members. Jeanette, you are here? I see you. Jeanette, do you want to do the roll call?
I absolutely can do that. Yes. Good morning, everyone. When I say your name, just note that you're here for the record, please. Keitra Armstrong. Oh, Keetra's not joined yet. Kathy Beauregard. No Kathy yet. Carrie Becker.
I'm here.
Secretary Benson.
I'm here.
Lauren Cartwright.
Here.
Carolyn Casson.
Here.
Ramona Cox.
I'm here.
Callie Crawford.
Present.
Joan Gershner.
It's Joanne. Sorry, it's Joanne, and I'm
sorry,
here.
Joanne.
It's okay.
I knew that. I apologize.
No worries.
Jennifer Granger.
Here.
Mike Gusweiler.
Here.
Carol Hutchins.
Here.
Samantha Mullet.
I'm here.
Erica Swilly. Erica's not here. And out of the advisory board members, Val Ackerman, Deborah Antone.
I think Sarah is here.
Yeah, I'm there for
Dr. Antoine.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Okay. Thanks, Sarah. Nina Chandri.
Here.
Judy Brown Clark. Dan Gould.
Here.
Richard Lapchick.
Here.
Heather Like.
Here.
Susie Merchant. Heather Mitzfeely.
Here.
Patty Phillips.
Here.
Scott Pioli. Sam Rappaport. Meg Singh.
Here.
Renee Torado.
Here.
Mark Ewell.
Here.
Malaya Zai.
Yep, Malia on behalf of
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I apologize. And we have a quorum, Secretary.
Okay, thanks, Jeanette. So great to see everyone, and Dr. Antoine, great to see you. We'll note that you're here too. And as I mentioned, this is our last virtual meeting. Our next meeting will be in person this fall in Michigan, of course, and so we're looking forward to that. And we're going to be talking a lot about that today, because that's really our planned workshop, where we're going to bring together all of the research and drill down into the particular recommendations that we want to have on the table for recommending to the governor. So we're gonna we've got a lot to get through today. I know it's been several months since we met, but we've got a really strong timeline, and the big news as well, of course, is that we've got a really strong staff now in Michelle Lewis-Watts, who's joined us as the director of the task force, and so you'll be hearing a lot from her today. But before we start, I want to do a few updates with regards to our membership. Of course, I want to recognize Coach Hutchins and her team, who won the Big 10 softball championship. And I'm not sure if Hutch is here yet, but a great victory. And the Wolverines completed their 2021 season with a 38-8 record, capturing the program's 22nd Big Ten Conference title and their third in a row, and reached the NCAA tournament for the 26th straight year. So a great victory for our coach, for Coach Hutch, and we also have Michaela Kelly from Martin Luther King Junior High School in Detroit and Central Michigan University, who was drafted 21st overall in the second round in the 2021 WNBA draft. She was drafted by the Connecticut Sun. So another great victory for women in sports in Michigan as well that we wanted to recognize. You may be noticing Sally Marsh, who has been a part of this task force since its beginning, has now left to go to Stanford Law School this fall and is taking the summer to begin that transition. So with Sally's exit, we have three individuals continuing a lot of that work. I talked about Michelle, and I'll go into more detail in her role in a minute. But of course, we also have Sarah Reinhardt and Jeanette Sawyer here still handling a lot of the administrative work for the task force. We're going to talk bulk of today about the timeline for the rest of this year and what that looks like. And Michelle's going to go over that as she's really done a drill down into what that looks like. But I think the overall goal, both for today and for this year, is to end this year with a really strong set of recommendations within the three areas that we have consistently focused on as a task force: the K through 12, opportunities for women, for girls to play sports, the K through 12 level, opportunities for women to play and coach or serve as athletic directors at the collegiate and university level, and then opportunities for women to play and serve as coaches in the professional sports realm. And so those three areas, one of the outcomes of today that Michelle will talk about is we're going to drill down into those with a continuation of those subcommittees as well that we created last year to really focus on, now that we've done the data collection in each of those three areas, the problem solving and the solutions. And I'll say, as I've said to many of you, one of the things that's consistently emerged is the need for more women coaches and athletic directors, and at the high school and collegiate level in particular. And so I already anticipate that solving for that is going to be a big, and recommendations that would solve for that would increase opportunities for women to serve as coaches and directors of athletic programs at the collegiate and maybe high school level as well, and in ways in which the state can invest in that and develop programming around that is probably going to be it's certainly going to be in, I think, the list of recommendations to the governor, but I know that's the top of a lot of your list. So I want to emphasize that at the outset. We'll be talking a lot about that, I think, in each of the three groups this year. So before we get too much more into substance and our work for today, just a few additional housekeeping pieces. We have to approve the meeting minutes from our December 2020 meeting, and those should be in front of you. In the December 2020 meeting, you'll recall we released and completed our research of the status of women in sports in Michigan. And Dr. Armstrong, of course, was a key component of that. Our friends at the Women's Sports Foundation was as well. And we also had public comment in December by Jenna Schroeder, who's an NBA referee from Flint, and now one of the 5 female referees in the NBA. And she'll continue, she'll be attending our fall meeting along with a number of other prominent women in sports to weigh in on and share her experiences and weigh in on some solutions. And we also developed and talked about the research that we've done in the areas of sports leadership, youth sports, colleges and university opportunities, and professional sports. So with that, I need a motion to approve the meeting minutes from December.
Motion.
Is there a second?
Second.
All approve?
Aye.
Aye.
Any not approve? Okay, great. The minutes have been adopted and they will be posted on our website. Also talked about in great deal at our meeting in December was the task force director. And thank you to many of you, not the least of which is Carolyn Casson, who led the process to hire a really tremendous leader already well-accomplished leader in women in sports, in Michelle Lewis Watts, who joins us here today and who is going to, I'm going to turn it over to her briefly in a few minutes to talk about some of the conversations she's already started having with all of you and report out from that, and then talk about our timeline and next steps, which she has developed. Should I call you Dr. Watts? Yes, Dr. Watts has joined us with, let me just pull up your bio. It's not in my notes. But really one of the great things about Dr. Watts and joining us is that she's done an incredible amount of work in this space as a champion for youth sports, a champion for girls in sports, as a mentor, as an educator, as a coach, and she really rose to the top of, we had multiple, and many of you were involved in this process, many applicants, a lot of well-qualified applicants, but one name rose to the top in everyone's, at every stage of the process, and that was Dr. Watts. So she has served as Chief Equity Officer and a Director of a Sports Management Program at Madonna University. She's also recently a head volleyball coach for 7 years at Detroit Public Schools, and professor and lecturer in sports administration at Wayne State University. She has her doctorate, her PhD in kinesiology and exercise science from Wayne State University, her master's in sports administration from Ohio University, and went to school also at North Carolina, where she got her undergraduate degree. She's on the vice chair of the board of directors of Detroit PAL, and another great partner organization, as well as co-founder and vice president of the Detroit Volleyball Coaches Association and a board member of the Boys to Men Youth Mentoring Program. So she's steeped in this work and in this world, not just broadly, but in Michigan. And we're really lucky to have her with us as not just someone who has studied extensively this work and ways to amplify opportunities for women in sports across the board, but also has walked the walk as a coach herself, as a mentor herself, and as someone who is involved with Detroit POW and continuing to provide more opportunities for young people to participate in sports and for women in particular to participate. So Dr. Watts, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk a little bit more about the conversations that you've had with many of our members one-on-one, and then and your thoughts on and vision for the task force this year and moving forward, and then go into our timeline for the rest of our time together. And I'll just emphasize that we've got about 1 year left in our task force. The task force appointments and the task force itself is set to dissolve in next summer. And so the timeline is built towards that. Of course, we're also we're about halfway through our tenure as a task force, and we're halfway through our work. And the second half is going to be, I'm really excited about, because this is all about the solutions. This is about the policies. This is about the ideas now that we've done the research. And with that, Dr. Watts is here to guide us through identifying solutions and proposals and recommendations to the governor that can really continue our goal and position Michigan as a leader in women in sports and in policies and advancing opportunities for women in sports. So with that, Dr. Watts, I'll turn it over to you to talk about your conversations, vision, and impressions so far. And then we'll go into the timeline for the rest of this year and talk about our plans between now and the fall.
Thank you very much, Secretary Benson. And thank you to everyone who was part of the selection committee. Special shout out to Carolyn Casson for being a champion for me for this role. So really excited to be a part of the team and really move this work forward. As Dr. Benson said, I've been in this space around girls in sports for a while. And so this gives me an opportunity to make a much bigger impact. A lot of the work I've done has been really on the ground, interacting on a regular, almost daily basis with young women. But this allows me to have a different impact. So just happy to be a part of moving this work forward. And it's been great getting to know the committee members so far, the task force members so far. So I was able to talk to about 12 of the task force members before this meeting, and just to kind of get some some background on each of them, as well as level step myself as we move forward. Where is everybody's heads at? Where do we need to go? And the good news is through those conversations, there were quite a few themes that rose. So people are, for the most part, on the same page about the work that needs to be done and the solutions that need to come. So just want to talk through those themes really quickly. And so one was to make sure we have broad, barrier-free access to physical activity. This came up for quite a few members, particularly as it relates to underprivileged or underserved communities. So how do we make sure as many girls as possible have opportunities within sports? And research, sadly, right, kind of continues year after year where it's the same kind of barriers that rise up. And so, but I think there's an opportunity to really work in that space to make sure girls know where the opportunities are, but also to make sure that they can get access to them. A second theme that rose was to make sure that we had a pipeline as it relates to what Secretary Benson mentioned around coaches and having access to being an athletic director or working within the industry, is that we need to make sure the pipeline is full and ready. And one of the ways to make sure the pipeline is ready is to make sure there's role models and mentors. So again, it comes down to opportunity and access, raising awareness that one, these jobs exist, but also how to get into those jobs, because now I see someone who looks like me, in that position, which is my own personal experience. When I decided to pursue a career in sports, it was because of my college volleyball coach, right? The person that I spent a lot of time with. Number three, accountability and incentives. So how do we make sure people are know the rules and then are held accountable to the rules? We're all familiar with Title IX. I consider myself a Title IX baby because of the work that the folks before me did. And so how do we make sure people are accountable to Title IX? But one of the things that we know, and I experienced this as a professor, is most people don't even know Title IX, particularly the girls that come into my program. They've never really even heard of it. And at that point, coming out of high school, they now know all the opportunities that were missed or all the rules that were broken. And now in college, at least they're a little bit more informed and they can maybe do a little bit of the fight. And so we need to raise the awareness level around Title IX, but also start to hold folks accountable to that. And maybe incentives is another way to do that. So we, carrot versus stick approach to that, as well as other rules that could be put in place. The fourth thing that arose was around allyships and partnerships. So who should we be working with to make sure that this work continues and these opportunities and the solutions that we actually come up with work? So we need to figure out what organizations we can partner with, such as Girl Scouts of Southeastern Michigan, for example. They have a captive audience, a group of girls. And so how do we work with organizations like that, but also look to other groups who may not be directly in this space, but are an important partner for this. So for example, some of the professional sports teams, well, they might not be recruiting girls to play on their teams, but certainly from a marketing standpoint, a business standpoint, girls and women are an important part of their audiences. And so they need to be a part of this conversation as well. And the last thing that rose up was to make sure we are being intentional and specific when we speak to the needs of girls. Even though we want to be broad in our efforts, girls sports, as most of you know, is different than boys sports. The impact of girls sports is different for them than it is for boys. And so we need to make sure we're intentional and specific for that. And the same conversation can be had for women in the workplace. The barriers to women to coaching, whether it's gender bias by the folks doing the hiring, or their own perceptions about, I don't know if I can be a mother or raise a family and be a coach. And so we need to be able to address some of those issues so that we change, right, go back to changing that pipeline and making sure people know that this is an accessible opportunity for you. And some of that means that we have to change the mindset of the folks on the other side to say, this is how this can work. It doesn't have to be the same way that we've been doing it, right, for the last 50 or so years. We can do something different. So again, those were the themes that came up from my conversations. And was, again, glad to hear that most people were all on the same page. Some really great ideas that we'll dig into as a committee, as a task force later on as we get into the real work, but really good conversation. So thank you for everyone I was able to have a conversation with.
Thank you, Dr. Watson. Thank you. I'm glad so many of you all were able to connect and welcome her in. And if anyone, particularly our advisory committee, we prioritize the task force members, but anyone on our advisory committee would be open to those conversations as well. I think that would be very helpful and informative. And as we now turn into talking about the timeline, as we reflect back on where we've come from and what the road ahead is at this sort of midway point of our work as a task force. I'll turn it back over to Dr. Watts in a minute to talk more specifically about how those conversations have informed the development of our next steps. But to offer some broad strokes, I'll say, it's been, we've done really incredible work together over the past year and a half, even in the midst of the pandemic, or even just almost 2 years now, since we first convened in June of 2019. And over that time period, I think we've really got a sense of the issues, the inequalities, the inequities in our state. And we've also seen and commented on many of the challenges, which we're going to talk about shortly as well, or after we talk about the timeline. We, of course, saw the issues with the WNBA, or I'm sorry, the women's basketball in college sports in the NCAA tournament. And our friends from the Women's Sports Foundation have been doing a lot of work on that. So we'll talk about that a little bit later, and how we can play a part in some of the more national conversations as well, and efforts. But as we look forward over what the next year looks like, we're really now at a point of saying, what within each of those three categories, youth and sports, college and universities, and professional, what's the legislation? What are the policies? What are the investments? What are the incentives? As Dr. Watts mentioned, what's the funding? What are some of the programs that the state can invest in, can incentivize, can develop and initiate to really move the ball forward? And what do those metrics look like? And so the rest of this year, it looks really like sort of two parts to it. First, and again, Dr. Watts will go into more detail on this, but the first is the part between now and today's meeting and our fall annual meeting. And we'll talk about the fall annual meeting shortly, but the vision for that fall meeting is we all come together, our advisory members, our task force members, some additional friends and experts in this work, to brainstorm and emerge from that day with a list of 3 to 5 specific solutions in each of these three categories that we then spend, and then our staff and our team then spend the subsequent time writing about, researching, and developing to move towards releasing and submitting our final report to the governor in coordination or at the same time of the celebrations around the 50th anniversary in Title IX in June of 2022. Between now and that fall meeting, we don't want to just show up to that fall meeting with a blank slate, because we have no need to. We've done almost 2 years of research, and all of you are experts. All of you already have ideas. And so we want to actually spend the time between now and the fall breaking into and having a few conversations that Dr. Watts will lead in those subgroups to begin the exploration or the suggestions of what those 3 to 5 recommendations might be. We want in that fall meeting to come up with more, but we want to begin that fall meeting with a presentation of some initial ideas that have come from all of you, so that we can hit the ground running on that day, present some initial ideas, get feedback on them, and then present some new ones, develop some new ones while we're together, and emerge out of that day with, again, a good sense of what those 3 to 5 recommendations within each category might be. So between now and then, we've got some work to do, beginning today, to really drill down into what we want to think, or what we want some of those solutions to be. And Dr. Watts, I'll turn it back over to you to talk about both the subcommittees as well as the additional research that also perhaps needs to be done on sort of the status as well as potential solutions in your view. And also, and I know this is really important for all of us, what our rubric for recommendations is going to be. In other words, we can come up with some great ideas, but we want to know they're actually going to work. And so what are the metrics that we're going to agree upon that would actually measure the impact and evaluate or predict what the impact and the results will be of these recommendations, so that we're coming up not just with great ideas, but we have confidence that those ideas, if implemented, will actually lead to certain impacts that we're all behind. So Dr. Watts, I'll turn it back over to you to go into more detail on all those things.
Thank you. And Sarah, are you able to share the timeline on the screen? Thank you. So this timeline was built with the end in mind, and actually the original timeline was in reverse order. So June 2022 is what we're heading toward, which is the 50th anniversary of Title IX. And that will be the release of the final report and the ideas that this group will come together with. We're thinking that we would hold a celebration or some type of media event to announce these recommendations. And this would involving the media, right? Making sure that this message gets out in a wide standpoint. And what we might be doing at that time is making sure that some of you are available, task force members, as well as advisory board members are available to talk about these recommendations, to make sure that your expertise, your credible voice is a part of that conversation. And so that's what we're working toward over the next year. So you can go back to the top, Sarah. Thank you. So obviously we're in the month of May. Already had my conversations with task force members. We're at our meeting, as Secretary Benson mentioned. We're looking to form 3 subcommittees, and some of you obviously fit in some natural places based on your backgrounds and your experience. And within that, as she said, we'll look at those four buckets for each of those groups. And I think the most important piece is going to be that rubric for evaluating recommendations and solutions. So there's obviously going to be hundreds and hundreds of ideas that we can implement, but which ones are going to be sustainable? Which ones can be funded? And again, as a group, we'll decide what that criteria, those rubrics will be. But that's one area that people can start thinking about is, what makes for a really great solution in this space, something that can actually be, implemented and activated. One of the things that came out of the previous recommendations from the report and the research that was done was around a non-school sport survey. And so this is something we can discuss, is if we think we do need to do a non-school sports survey, since the first level of research was done with schools. I have some thoughts about that. What we tend to find is that the research sometimes is often similar and not necessarily revealing of anything new that we don't necessarily already know. And so we might not want to spend the time to do that, but if the task force feels strongly about that, we can certainly go into that space and look at what's happening in the non-school sports or non-education based sports, because obviously they are run a little bit differently. But the things that need to happen, whether you're in school or out of school, how coaches interact with young people, the opportunities and such, they need to look very similar, even though they might be executed a little bit differently. And I'm open to any thoughts or comments about that pretty quickly, if anybody wants to share anything on that.
Any feedback on that? Should we look into the non-school sports piece, or do folks feel we've got enough, or just interested in just additional data collection? Dr. Armstrong, I imagine you might have some insights there too that you want to.
Yeah, I really think it depends on when we say we need more information from the non-school sports. So for example, with the leadership, it was the whole gamut. It went to, some industry people in community recs as well. So I think, some of that information is captured, but I do agree with Dr. Watts that, you can do a whole landscape of what we know about girls and women in sport. And just to be honest, there's very little new that's under the sun. And so that comes to a point what's called oversaturation, where we're just repeating the obvious, we're revealing the obvious. And so unless we think that there's something somewhere that we're missing, I'm not sure. I kind of agree with Dr. Watts. I'm not really sure if that endeavor is worth the time to undertake. Because one of the things we can do, we can look at the primary data we have, and we've tried to gather a swath of data from a lot of places, but we can also look at secondary data that's collected from other places that are similar. And unless there's something unique that's bubbling up that we think we haven't, we don't have our finger on the pulse, I'm not sure that it would be worth it. But I welcome the whoever, like where these suggestions are coming from. Obviously, there's a reason perhaps if they think there's something out there that we haven't captured. I think that's worth exploring.
Thank you. Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll jump in, and I probably was at least a backer, if not suggesting that we look at non-school surveys, but perhaps, as Dr. Watt said and Dr. Armstrong, I mean, the research that we have to date probably would be repeated, and maybe we don't need to take that time. But what I would suggest is, non-school sport would be like Boys and Girls Club, YMCA, Parks and Rec, and the work that we do as a sports commission, which is typically travel sports. We know that there is certainly an economic barrier for travel sports, but many of these clubs and organizations do have scholarships and capability. So perhaps not a survey, but also looking at non-school organizations as solution opportunities to implement some of these solutions that we find. That I believe, at least on the youth level, there are several organizations we can look at that are not school-based that could implement some of these solutions that we come up with.
I'd like
Thank
to
you
just
for
make a
that.
comment to add on that. I think those are great points, and I agree that there's probably significant research out there already, so no need to recreate anything. But I do think it's good to keep it on the radar, because they're like funding structures and just models of those organizations are different, and they do, when we think about opportunity and equity and opportunity, I think they're a very important player in the youth sports and sports for young girls and those opportunities. And I think that there might just be things to consider as the state of Michigan considers more broadly investment in children and students in the outside of school time. And so I think that since there's movement in that space, how, as sports is one of the most common activities that students participate when they're not in school, how are those not lost in that after school conversation, and any discussions about increased investment in that space. So I just think continuing to keep it top of mind is important, even if additional data is not collected.
Thank you. Dr. Cox, did you want to weigh in as a non-school based program?
Sure. I think that, I'm agreeing with everyone else in terms of, having that research, but like Malia says, just keeping it on the radar. So, I'm agreeing with everyone else.
Okay, thank you. And
Sure.
I think what we can do is maybe not do such a tight drill down on the data as far as the number of girls that are participating. There may be some other ways to gather data or more useful information from those groups. So thank you for that discussion. So what we would like to do moving forward in the month of June and July is to start to really get those recommendations going once we set up our subcommittees, and to start those conversations so that when we, as Secretary Benson said, that we get back in the fall, that we're not starting fresh, that we'll have something to present to you. And so that would happen, and I know the summer can be a tough time, particularly in Michigan, because we all like to enjoy our warm weather when we have it. But I think we can do a little bit of that work as we prepare. And I think the other thing that we can do over the summer, particularly because of the non-school sport organizations are in, they're in full swing at that time, or as full swing as you can be based on COVID regulations right now, is that maybe there are some site visits, there's some other conversations that happen. Maybe this is qualitative as opposed to quantitative, in that space. So in August, tentatively, what I see happening is getting that feedback and then redistributing it out to the committee. And so again, taking it another step before we get back all together, so that we're starting to analyze a little bit of where we're going. And so again, at that fall meeting, we would actually be drilling down a little bit deeper instead of just brainstorming at that point. Tentatively September, and I'm sorry, I'm about to call her Dr. Benson. I'm sure you wouldn't mind that, right? Secretary Benson, I'm not sure if we'll talk about it later as far as the actual meeting date. But this will be adjusted depending on our final selection of a meeting date for the fall meeting. We would then at that meeting start presenting those recommendations, and again, based on the rubric that we start to come up with, start to drill down those suggestions, making sure that they fit, that we think they're actually executable. In October and November, in the fall, just highlighted a couple of important days, and so those could also be moments for us to talk to the media about what we're working on, to kind of raise the level of the conversation. The Detroit Free Press Marathon happens in the fall, and as well as National Coaches Day. And so again, just maybe some opportunities to raise awareness about what we're doing. Late in the year, around December, is when we will look at actually drafting the layout of the report, what it's actually going to look like from a presentation standpoint. And so that will be much more, behind the scenes work. And we will continue to refine our recommendations that will actually go into that report. Moving into the next year, we'll start to, again, drill down to more behind the scenes work, scheduling the actual event, getting on calendars to make sure we can have the people that we want at the space, which for a lot of people, 6 months is just about right to lock people in, particularly again, because we're talking about potentially a summer date. And then we would start to make sure that everyone had that date on their calendar, finalizing budgets for the report itself, and then getting ready for another task meeting. For that task force meeting in February, again, we would be looking at those recommendations and getting really specific feedback, right? Really narrowing it down. Some other things are scheduled to happen in February. So again, another moment to lift up the work and celebrate, publicly. So Girls and Women's Sports Day, as well as the MHSAA Women in Sports Leadership Conference typically happens in that month. Although I will tell you, I always ask why it's over Super Bowl weekend, Mark, just FYI. It's always a conflict watching the game. Moving into March, we would look at our event list. Who do we want to actually invite to the event? Obviously, we would have press there, but one of the things that we can do with that event is to actually have a visual, right, of girls being athletic, being physical. And so what you see that first bullet for March 2022 is that we can include some performance groups. So whether that's a dance team, a steppers group, having some trick basketballers there. I think the visual will be really, really important aspect of, again, just getting the message out and giving the media something that they can show. Also in March, of course, celebrating Women's History Month and International Women's Day, again, yet another time for us to lift up the work that we're doing and really get that message going and really lead into, what would be coming into the summer. By April, we hope that we would be you would have already received the report and you have an opportunity to review a second draft of it so that we're getting right close to perfection at that point, and then obviously getting close to getting ready to print a few copies of the actual report. May, right, final review of the report, sending out invites for the event, confirming with the governor, of course, and then making sure that task force members know what's coming in June. And here we are, voila, June, if that is indeed the date that we select, we would be providing the report in a public way, having, again, that media event, talking to media, doing some stories ahead of time, and then again, utilizing task force members as well as advisory board members to talk about this work in a much bigger way than just the state of Michigan. One of the things that the secretary has mentioned is, being a leader across the nation for this. So this is when task force members and advisory board members would be really, really helpful in getting that message out across the country that this is, how you can create change for, women and girls in sports. So I'll stop there and welcome any questions or feedback on the second part.
Great, thank you. I think if I think we're all familiar enough with Zoom at this point. If you want to raise your hand in the Zoom, I think you do it by selecting, I don't know, finding your name in the participant side and selecting raise your hand or something like that. But so you could either actually raise your hand or electronically raise your hand, but feedback and thoughts on that timeline. I mean, that's basically the path forward for the next year, and one that gets us in a position, I think, to really culminate all of our work in a way that is very impactful and timely. So is there anything we're missing? Are there other things that folks think we should be thinking about or incorporating in our plan? And if not, we can go into a discussion of the subcommittees and any details there. Feedback, input.
And all of the task force members, you should have been emailed the timeline. So if you need to provide feedback offline as well, that's fine.
And I think on that note, then, I mean, this is there, are there other things, are there other events, is there other work that we should be incorporating into our plan for the next year? Is there, or additional conversations that Dr. Watts or others should be a part of or participate in? Are there, any other kind of things that, because this is it. This is the last year. This is the work that we're doing. Is there anything else that folks feel is not included? We've got this meeting, our fall meeting, and then one more meeting after that in early at 22. And then of course our big event in June. So that would give us 3 remaining meetings after today, all in person. And similarly, I think for the fall event, we're envisioning that's a full day event in Detroit. We have, I believe, the ability to cover travel costs for folks coming in from out of town. But one of the things we'd also want for that is if there are additional folks who we should include in that discussion and that should be there. We'll be inviting, for example, Sheila Ford, the owner of the Lions, who has expressed an interest in being involved. So we'll work to have her attend. The governor will likely attend for part of it. So it will be a big conversation where the day will be broken into ultimately 3 parts. One, a report out initially of the subcommittees, talking about what you've identified as some initial solutions. And then secondly, both feedback and conversations for added solutions and ideas and thoughts about those. And then finally, matching everything around the rubric and voting on really the recommendations that we want to explore further, which we'll then do in the months ahead, and then report back on that further exploration at our early 2022 meeting before finalizing the report and releasing it in June. Any other feedback or insights? Or Dr. Watts, do you want to go straight into rubric then? Or subcommittees?
Yes, we can go into subcommittees.
So you recall we had 3 subcommittees already in place that were organized around the 3 buckets that we've really focused on since our inception. And this is a moment where Dr. Watts and Jeanette also will send a note out on who wants to participate in what, but is there any other additional insights into those really more focused conversations that we'll be having in June, or thoughts about or insights into, again, anyone feel strongly that we're leaving anything out or that is not sufficient, or any other feedback on the immediate next steps in the subcommittee, or we should call them what we called them last time, which were concentrated conversations in these 3 areas, so that no one should feel as that they can only, and it's real, that's really all it is. It's just a concentrated conversation that we'll have in June in these 3 areas through conference calls that Dr. Watts will convene, where the focus will be on suggesting solutions, initial solutions for the 3 areas. For women to play sports at K through 12, for women to play and coach in college and universities and serve as ADs, and for women to serve as players and coaches and professional.
Some of the conversations I had with some individual task force members, a few people have a little bit of overlap. And so I think that concentrated conversation is important. So for those of you that might work in college now, but you have a lot of experience in youth, we might want your voice, in both of those spaces and vice versa. So you won't necessarily be assigned to one area, and that's the only area that you can engage in. We will want your voice and opinion across several spaces. So if there are people that want to be in all 3, you just have to let us know that, and so that when we start scheduling the conversations, we make sure that we are not overlapping too much or using up too much of your time. But again, the goal would be to look at the 4 areas within each of those 3 areas. So programming, legislative policy, investment funding, looking at that within youth sports, within college, university, and within the professional ranks. I think the only other thing that we would make sure we would add in those conversations are the career opportunities. Perhaps that's something else that did come up in some of the conversations, Secretary Benson, is to making sure that girls know what are all the different career options within the sports industry. So here's an area that you love, you have passion for, you love sports. Here are all these jobs you never knew existed within the space, in addition to being a coach.
Great. So we'll do as we did before, set up the times for those concentrated conversations in those 3 areas. We may have more than one if we have to. And then Jeanette will send those around for folks to participate in and choose what or multiple conversations you want to be a part of. And then finally, rubric for the recommendations. I think this is really important because none of us want to suggest something that's not going to have a real impact. And Dr. Lapchick, I'd really be interested in your thoughts, or our friends at Women's Sports Foundation, or Patty Phillips, the folks who have done this, Nina Chaudhry, and the national level, and have really seen on the academic side what we should be doing to evaluate impact, because part of these solutions will ultimately highlight the limited impact of Title IX and other past solutions, while trying to move forward into a more impactful selection. But what have you all seen, or what would you all recommend as some ways of evaluating the impact of, or the anticipated impact of recommendations? Because again, I'd love to come up with some great ideas, but we want to make sure whatever we present to the governor are ones we feel confident in saying these will actually make a difference. I feel like a teacher and I just called on people and everyone's like trying to decide who's going to talk.
This is what happens. This is what it's like in the classroom. We have to be comfortable with the silence. So one of the pieces that did come up, and I'll start it for you, is that it should be sustainable. And so I think what we need to decide is, what do we mean by sustainable, right? So does that mean human intervention? Does that mean financial interventions? What have folks seen around what has made a program or a change sustainable? Don't all answer at once.
So you're really just looking for what we think the metric should be to evaluate impact. That's your question, right?
Yes.
I think it's, to me, I'm trying to wrap my head around, and my brain's going in a lot of different directions as it relates to, for me, the college space. I guess I feel like I want to have a better understanding of what it is that we're trying to evaluate, and I feel like how we evaluate it will come naturally after we figure that out. That's how my brain works.
Yeah, when we think about the recommendations that we're going to put forth in this report, so 3 to 5 in each of those 3 bucket areas, we could put 100 on the list. So how do we narrow down our choices to 3 to 5?
Okay.
We want it to be in a systematic way that we decide what the recommendations are, as opposed to, well, I've seen this work, in this place. Well, that's okay, right? Like, we need something a little bit more robust to make sure the recommendations make sense and can live after this, task force, because it does, dissolve. Does that help, Carrie?
Yeah.
Can you put the record? So to go back to Carrie's question, I'm with Carrie that there's just been a lot of information, on the call, and there's been so much work by all of you, which is fantastic. I mean, if we're asked to evaluate the metrics, can we put up what, you said the 3 to 5 buckets or the changes, and maybe go through them one by one, or have something to one specific one at a time? I mean, overall, coming up with how we're going to measure these changes, it's like, it's a big deal. And I know from our perspective, we have to measure process and progress. The outcome isn't always what we intend it to be. So I think we have to be careful with that piece, especially in the college space, or as it relates to hiring practices, because we don't make the hires. So then the measuring can't necessarily be the hire. I mean, we wish it could. And I know Dr. Lapchick does a lot of work here too. So I think just if there's a specific metric maybe that we want to talk through as a group, and then talk about what that could be, might be helpful.
Yeah, and Patty, I'll add on that. I mean, the example of a metric would be implementation, and that sort of relates to sustainability, but practicality of implementation, let's say.
Right.
So in the example that we keep honing in on, and that will ultimately be part, how do we get more women coaches at every level, and more women leaders and as directors at every level? I mean, that's clearly one of the things you want to solve for. As we evaluate ideas, one of the metrics is, well, would this actually work? Is this actually going to be sustainable? Is this actually going to be practically able to be implemented? And if so, how? Because so I think that's what we're trying to get at, and that we want to have sort of a set sort of guidelines of, as we evaluate recommendations, what should we be evaluating them based on? So for and what that ultimately helps us generate is a sense of, and I know it is hard to talk in the abstract, and so I think maybe this is just to get us kind of focused on that, so that when we get to the fall, we'll be able to just have some kind of agreed upon language, essentially, in which we can evaluate these ideas. But so for let's take the Rooney type rule, for example. We know that simply just requiring the interview doesn't necessarily generate what you all results. Even just hiring someone doesn't necessarily generate results. What you ultimately need, and what makes an idea practical, is having people on the hiring committee and the interview committee and the recruitment committee that are bought in and invested in prioritizing diversity and diversifying women's leadership. And so if the idea is programming or some sort of requirement of some sort of Rooney Rule-esque requirement of interviewing or consideration of female candidates in different positions, the metric would be of is this practical and able to be implemented? The rubric would be yes, it would be if we have these other things. And so I know we're trying to take I see in doing this a more academic approach to some practical solutions, and all of us are practitioners for the most part. So but I think we're trying to get one, and Dr. Watts, you may want to weigh in more on kind of the goal here, but I think the goal is to get one set of one kind of agreed upon set of language pieces or ideas that we want to use to evaluate the impact. And we don't have to agree upon these today or anything like that, but we just want to begin the discussion so that we're not just talking about ideas, but we're actually focused on their implementation.
Right. So one of the things that you just mentioned, Patty, is it measurable? Can we measure the outcome of the recommendation? So, pie in the sky is great, and then all of a sudden we put it down and we're like, well, we don't know. We have no way of knowing that it's successful. So the recommendations need to have some type of measurable component, would be an example of a metric that we could include. I see Dr. Lapchick, you took yourself off mute. Did you want to contribute?
Well, I'm mired in 35 years of racial and gender report cards. So for me, gathering the data, maybe with where you were in Michigan when the task force started, I think Ketra might have done some of that in her initial research, and then have it where it is as you approach that final meeting, and maybe compare it to the national averages, might be useful in making your arguments compelling to adopt whatever hiring practice rules you come up with. And obviously I've been a proponent of the Rooney Rule. I call it the Judy Sweet Rule sometimes. Whoever it's named after, we've got to change our hiring practices to make more opportunities for women and people of color, period. They're lagging so far behind, particularly on the gender issue on a national level, and in all the report cards, including college sport.
And then, for example, the report card could be an idea that we bring down to K through 12 education. That can be one of the recommendations, that we start providing a report card. And so the report card, right, automatically meets the measurable component, if that's going to be one of our metrics. So
Heather, I see your hand is up too.
Yeah, I was just trying to think of the metrics also. And I think that moving forward, a good thing would be to, and we've already done this, is measure the amount of females that are playing youth sports in that year, and then continue to keep track of that. So from the youth perspective, that would be the metric, because even the Women's Sports Foundation has said the likelihood of females dropping out of sports, the percentage of that. So that's something that they've kept track of. I think it's something that we could start from a Michigan perspective. And then if you wanted to go nationally, but that's something yearly from a youth perspective. And then for college, I think it's just watching women graduate from playing a sport and then seeing whether or not they remain in the sports area. So I think that's something that's measurable also.
Thank you. Carolyn, you had taken yourself off mute a moment ago. Did you remember your thought?
Yeah, it's, oh, did I get off? I think it's similar to Richard, you know, in trying to upend gender and racial bias in something seems to me to be pretty big thing to measure. And so you have to back into it, has been my experience. If we could envision in each of these task forces, what success would look like, or at least a view. I don't think people have a view. And I think that's why we flounder around to find measures. I'd like to see us take a few minutes, maybe at the beginning of these task forces, and say, describe what this would actually look like. Here are the 100 solutions. Here are the 10 that could be measurable, sustainable, fundable, and then we can kind of keep narrowing it down. It just seems to me you can't start with what do we need to measure. You got to start with what are we trying to accomplish. And we know kind of what it is in the abstract, but I don't think we've described it. So that's what I was thinking about.
Yeah, I want to plus one that for Carolyn and to say the same. It's kind of, what does success look like? And maybe starting with the simple, what are we trying to solve for? Identify that, and then also attaching to that, what are the anti-goals around it as well? So that we don't try to boil an ocean, and we can, narrow it down to the top two. But I think, even identify anti-goals around this would be super helpful.
Thank you.
Dan?
From my end, it might, the Kellogg Foundation that's been around a while have done like logic models. So if you set up your recommendations, if there's 5 recommendations for college, and at the way end of the logic model, you have outcome goals, more women head coaches, more athletes within 4 years going into coaching that were college athletes, whatever that is. And then you work backwards and you have more process or short-term goals. And I'm just making stuff up here. Every university has an advocate, a position where it's advocating for more women coaches. They run workshops for college athletes their senior year. Again, I'm just making things up, but you kind of develop that model out and then looking at that and say, is that feasible? Could we do that? One of the earlier questions I thought of, and it's a different area, but in coaching, education, did a lot of work over the years with the Olympic Committee. A lot of talk, nothing happened until they appointed somebody who was held accountable. So to me, having some people, maybe that's a goal. How many people are in charge of K-12 or high school, et cetera, that are held accountable for increasing the bar? And so those are kind of things I might think of. Maybe we get the recommendations and kind of work out a logic model, short, long-term goals, what kind of activities would lead to it. And then is that even feasible? I have a lot of good ideas we can never do because I'm always broke. So.
Well, and that gets to another point of should we work in developing a funding model for different things that we can also recommend. And so one of the metrics is, can we create a funding model for it and make recommendations on how it could be funded if it involves funding. And our foundation friends might be insightful here too, but I think that's another piece of that. But I think the accountability piece, I certainly want us to consider a cabinet level type position on sports administration. I think Val Ackerman, who's on our advisory committee, recommended that. I think Dr. Lapchick, you might have talked about that at different points. I don't know if it would actually come, but part of being able to argue that is, it's all integrated in terms of how we would then make the argument that having a cabinet level position would bring accountability, and that matters for all these other things. So I think we also just need to get in the mindset of thinking about how all the recommendations also integrate with each other to enhance their respective impact and implementability.
I have one thing to, I guess, offer. I kind of like the, Richard's report card. And I think about one of our goals is to have more women coaching, and more young women going into coaching. And yet I think that just the actual public awareness, I think of the athletic directors that don't even notice that only a quarter of their staff is women, and that there are no women in leadership positions that surround them. We have SWAs who largely have maybe more power than some, but largely they just do all the grunt work and so forth. And to me, making an awareness piece out of this to call into attention, whether it's all the colleges in the state, all the state funded schools, and at the high school level. I mean, college coaches and high school coaches, that the representation is very similar. And to bring that out into the public, where the leadership positions from college campuses or secondary schools, a college president would never allow to only have 25% women represented in their faculty, but they don't take any notice that all athletic departments are severely underrepresented. So I think an awareness piece would be the way to start getting the people that need to be aware of it. In addition to whether we go with the Judy Sweet rule, or as I'm a big advocate of gender bias training from the get-go. So that's my 3 cents worth.
So one thing that I would just add is it feels like we're having two kind of simultaneous conversations, right? So initially it sounded like we wanted a rubric for assessing potential solutions, and it feels like we're now talking about measuring success long-term. So I think also just being clear about, we probably need both, right? And so making sure that we're all on the same page in terms of what we're talking about when we're talking about what we're evaluating, I think would be helpful. And I can touch base with our, head of research and education to make sure that, on the solution side, as we evaluate some of the potential solutions, I'm sure she'll have some feedback there. But I think there's probably 2 parallel tracks that are happening right now from what I'm hearing, is how do we evaluate all of the very good solutions that we're hearing to figure out what we recommend. And then once we figure out what we recommend and we have that rubric, how do we measure the success of those recommendations long term, right? So there are 2 things where we kind of need to come up with that evaluation in that rubric.
Right, and then the third conversation that's also happening is, well, what does it actually look like? Where are we trying to go, right? So in general, we want to increase opportunities, but how do we know when we get there? Is that 1 girl? Is it 100 girls? Is it 1,000 girls? And so that, to Carolyn's point, is to be a little bit more specific about what does it look like, right? And to Dan's point, as part of the model, what does it look like on the other end? And when does it look like that? Is it 2023? Is it 2025? Is it 2030? So I think that is another conversation that does need to happen, is when we look back on this, right, we say, yes, I made that happen. Well, what did you make happen? Well, we made sure 1,000 girls got to play sports who never would have gotten to play sports. And we have 50 new, college athletic directors that are now women. So, so thank you, Sarah. It's 3 conversations that we are kind of having right now. But I think the ideas that are generating are helping me formulate some more notes, and the list of what those metrics could be are coming out of these, kind of double conversations that we're having. So thank you.
I just want to bring up something in the chat as well from Renee Tirado, who previously was the Chief Diversity Director of Major League Baseball, about ownership, meaning she wrote sustainable change equals investment, ownership, and metrics. And so just to maybe add, and this goes to the accountability piece, but just to maybe add another component of ownership, which is, I think, tied into accountability, but helpful to think about in a more, in my view, specific way of who would own this, and who would own this particular solution, who would ensure that it's implemented, and then what metrics would be used to evaluate its implementation. So just making sure we work that into our
Hey, Jocelyn, this Heather, I would, a couple things that come to my mind. There's no question you need quantifiable goals and objectives. We got to be able to measure it against where we are now and where we're going to be. And I do think that someone's got to own, I mean, I understand that the task force dissolves, but where's the reporting mechanism? Who's going to see this information? Who's it, where is it going to lie? Is it a cabinet member? Is it a creation of, if it's really important, you've got to have someone owning and thinking about this every day and managing it. The other thing, I mean, I think that a corresponding funding model, you can't have recommendations without corresponding finances. I mean, you have to, there's money that's going to be, whether that is, I also think from a quality of experience, what about the facilities, and I don't know, I don't understand every different state's funding model, but the reality of it is when state funds are allocated to public institutions, universities, if you're building a women's tennis complex or tennis courts for a high school for, or if it's a female sport, why can you not apply for a grant or funding model out of the state funds? I mean, it's just a way of, really demonstrating your commitment financially to the quality of the experience too. I mean, the disparate, I mean, I think, we all know the NCAA women's basketball thing, the disparate, but that's not, no, I think women in sports were not shocked by that. And so if you look at the quality of experience too, not just getting the number of kids, but, you get the number of kids there, and maybe it's not a facility, maybe it's just, tennis rackets or bats or gloves or whatever the young girls might need that, they might not be able to have in whether it's inner city schools or less resourced areas. But I think an opportunity that, I mean, it's a funding area in that area. And then I know that we, the Rooney Rule has been tossed around and there's no question that's important. But I really think if we thought intelligently as a group and brainstormed about a name, I mean, Judy Sweet, you mentioned, but I mean, is there really, I mean, the Rooney Rule, obviously there's profound respect for the Rooney family and what that was about, but is there really a woman that we could name it after that catches on like the Rooney Rule? Like, I don't want us to just say it's the Rooney Rule because that's different, like, is there something that and then it becomes Michigan started the whatever rule and everybody knows it by, instead of just saying it's the Rooney Rule. So I just try to think about who is that profound that's out there that we could think about, who may help back it and support that. If we put our brains together, maybe we come up with somebody.
Well, we do have a very, very well-known and successful softball coach with us on the task force, who is a legend in Michigan. Just pointing that out.
May I add to that? I mean, I think it's important. Yes, we should consider, renaming it, but also as a collective, how do we iterate on the Rooney Rule? Because what we do know is that it hasn't been super effective, and it has been, for the most part, very performative. So maybe the push here is how do we iterate on it to potentially drive the metrics in a way that will actually yield results? Because essentially, there are some that are still using it only as a check the box mechanism. So again, how do we iterate on the rule to actually, drive outcomes that will, impact and influence change?
Right, the Rooney Rule addresses diversity, but a lot of people can hide behind diversity. And so what we're really talking about is equity. And so thank you for bringing that point up, because if you looked at NFL coaches today, who was available to be interviewed and placed and how many were actually hired of people of color, the Rooney Rule you wouldn't even know it existed right today. And so I think that's a really great point, is to really talk about equity for girls as opposed to just, diversifying opportunities or experiences. I'm sorry, did I cut off somebody who was about to speak?
One of the things I think, as now this is crystallized, Sarah, you crystallized it for me because we were going in two different directions in the third. now I got it. So Secretary Benson, when you asked the question, how are we going to evaluate the recommendations that move forward? So now I'm hearing funding, feasibility, the report card. Those are the things we're going to look at. To me, I also think we have to look at how widespread is the impact of the recommendation. Because if there might be a great recommendation that we bring forward that really ends up increasing access for sports to girls in Grand Rapids. So maybe but we want it to be wider. So the expanse of the impact, I think, has to be considered when we start to look at all these recommendations that we come to in the fall. So because I think we want those 3 to 5 that we really take on have to have broad impact. So I guess that's a lens I would look at the recommendations through as well. There was something else. I'll have to think about it again, but as Sarah was talking, I'm like, I'll come back on.
I think that couples nicely with what Heather was mentioning about the quality of experience. So we're looking at, we can look at breadth and depth of the solution, right? It goes wide, but it also goes deep. And again, from an equitable standpoint, girls in underserved markets, whether that's urban or rural, have different needs, right, than girls in suburban communities. And so, if we're talking about funding, equipment needs versus transportation needs, right? We know in urban environments, transportation is an issue. In rural environments, it can be an issue too, because people are far away from each other sometimes, or they don't have the equipment. And so the breadth and depth, those combination of things, I think could be an important element of the evaluation matrix.
And, Carrie's point, I want to also expand upon a little bit, because I think there's value in having recommendations that other states can adopt and that have a broader impact beyond, or, that are replicable. Maybe that's a way to put it. Both effective and impactful and all the things we talked about, but also replicable, and have both a kind of localized, but also statewide, perhaps a statewide impact, or a localized impact with statewide relevance, if that makes sense. Or, so that, we don't want to, there may be policies that have a stronger impact in certain areas of the state that we want to promote, that would have, be an overall part of the state's story, even if the actual impact isn't felt the same throughout the state, as you just mentioned. So a localized impact with a statewide relevance, but also a replicable model that we can, or that others can take to other states, perhaps. And, just for consideration.
The other thing I'm thinking of is, I think a lot of what we're talking scale and scope, and how big of an impact. And there's always a trade-off. Like, I'm thinking the MHSAA has run their Women in Sport Leadership Conference, I don't know, Mark, 20 some years. It's up and running. If we did something to try to get more girls that go through that to go into coaching, and see if you could actually change the metrics in that's a lot more controllable to see if something would work. You already got a structure that's set up. So you might want some projects like that are short, are smaller, but could be a demonstration project. And then some bigger ones. The practical side of me, and Secretary Benson, apologies, but I don't think a lot of people trust government a lot right now. So
really, I don't expect, it's not something I experience every day.
Yeah. So if we have something that's government funded, obviously we want to have big long-term impact, but we better have some quick wins. So, it goes into the black hole and you never see. So some things that could come out and show some quick wins while you're working for the bigger long-term thing. So somehow, to me, that has to kind of tie together, but maybe taking a few things that we have more control of. If we can't do it there, forget kind of going all over the place. And, some targeted programs might be a start.
So he made me think about, in looking at it, what's the short-term win, what's the long-term win, but also when we look at recommendations, are there existing things already? You mentioned that Women in Sport, are there existing things already that we want to enhance as part of a recommendation? And what are the things that we want to just completely start from scratch? I think that's another lens I would look through. Is this we got to build it from the ground up, or is this, we're going to take this and this and enhance it, and then really have a conversation around what's going to give us the most breadth and depth of impact?
Well, I am really excited about our fall meeting because I think it's going to be a day-long, a series of conversations like this where we're generating ideas and then evaluating them, and it's going to be a lot of fun. The setup, we're going to transition now. I think unless anyone else has anything pressing, or Dr. Watts, if you have any concluding remarks, we want to transition into public comment. But I'll just say before we do that, I'm really looking forward to our fall event. The way that'll probably set up is we'll have a dinner the night before for everyone, probably somewhere in Detroit where we can just socialize and come together and talk. We'll again invite other folks, prominent members of the sports community, to that dinner as well. And then the next day, probably somewhere we looked previously at the Mike Ilitch School of Business in next to Little Caesars Arena in Detroit or somewhere around there. We'll have a day-long session of conversations like this, where we'll start the first half of the day again in the conversations we have between now and then, presenting and sort of digging in on some specific recommendations that we already have talked about, and then building off of that in the second half or in subsequent conversations to then generate new ideas in each of the three areas. And then we'll have lunch, and then at the end of the day, we'll have a conversation about what, and a vote ultimately on what do we want the recommendations to be, and we'll or what we want the next set of recommendations to pursue. And then again, we'll spend the following 3 to 4 months just doing a deep dive and really fleshing out all of the details, looking at best practices and just any other research we can find on the specific solutions that we'll ask your help with. And then we'll come back in February with the final presentation. And then that'll go into the finalization of the report. So lots of good stuff. And Dr. Watts, anything else you want to say? And then I actually want to turn it over to our friends at Women's Sports Foundation for some work they're doing around the response to the NCAA's.
I want to thank everyone for all their comments. I have a lot of notes that I've taken, and I'll organize those and we'll get those back out to the task force members. I think it was a really rich discussion. Everyone should have my email, but I'll put it in the chat as well. So if you have follow-up thoughts, if something popped in your head, feel free to shoot me an email, or I'll send me a text if you prefer that way, or to call me, so that we can continue this and make sure that we capture everyone's thoughts as we move forward. So.
And on scheduling, you'll see a couple of things coming forward. One, a scheduling of the concentrated conversations in June on the specific areas and specific solutions in each area. So I hope as many of you can participate in all of those as you can, as your schedules allow. If you have feedback or input or ideas and you can't make one of the concentrated conversations, you can send them to Dr. Watts or I, and we can make sure they're incorporated. You'll hear from us again in August with some more specific outputs of, well, you know the timeline, we just went through it. And then we'll also do a doodle poll. You'll hear from Jeanette over the next few weeks to schedule a time and date for the fall meeting. We're looking at September or October. We know both are busy times, but we hope to find essentially a 2-day window where folks would come the night before, have dinner, spend the next day, and then fly out at the end of the day if you're flying, or return home at the end of the day if you're local. And so with that, I'm going to turn to the public comment section of our meeting. We do have one person who's also signed up for public comment, but before we do that, I want to turn to our friends at the Women's Sports Foundation to talk about a letter that they've drafted to the NCAA in response to the March Madness inequities and how we can be helpful there.
Sure. Thank you, Secretary Benson. Good to see you all, and thank you for the opportunity to discuss this. So I'm going to put a link in the chat here. This is a link to a letter that WSF has drafted. Many of you have referenced what happened during March Madness at the basketball tournaments, right? The differences in the strength facilities and food. There were multiple things that were very inequitable and showcase some of the disparities that we see for women in college athletics and women across the board in Title IX compliance more broadly, right? This was not a huge surprise to many of us who are working closely in this space. So, but it became very visible on a very public scale. And so we very quickly released a statement and along with others asked for the NCAA to conduct a review of what decisions were made, what, that led to this point that allowed it to get to such disparate treatment between the men and women's tournaments. And so that review is currently ongoing. Right now, the first phase of that review is focusing in on the basketball tournaments, but then after that, there's a phase 2 of the review that will look at a select number of sports, because we know that this is not just about basketball, that this is, throughout all of collegiate sports, and it's not just NCAA led things, it happens on campuses as well. And so our goal here, the letter that I've linked to, is the Women's Sports Foundation is encouraging folks, both organizations and individuals, to sign on to this letter to make sure that the NCAA knows that folks are watching and that we are asking for them to be transparent in the review and the recommendations and the findings that come from that review. So I know several of you who are on the task force have already signed on, either as individuals or your organizations, and I thank you for your support, and certainly would welcome the Michigan Task Force to join as an organizational support as well, if that was something that you all were interested in. So wanted to present that opportunity, and certainly welcome you all to sign on as individuals as well.
Is there one thing we could have is a discussion, and Sarah, I think you put the letter in the chat if anyone wants to see it. And so thank you all for individually signing on to it. We can also entertain a motion for the task force collectively to sign on to it. And then we can vote on that if anyone wants to make a motion in that regard.
I'd make that motion.
Is there a second?
I second.
Thank you. So we've got a motion to have the task force collectively sign on. We can do just a voice vote on that. Or is there any discussion on the motion?
Point of order. Does advisory group vote or only the task force?
Just the task force members.
Thank you.
You can do a symbolic vote, Dr. Gold, if you like. Any discussion? And certainly anyone can individually sign on to the letter. I think that would also be embraced. So I think advisory members, if you haven't already signed on to the letter, you might want to look at it and consider signing on in your own individual capacity. Any other discussion on the motion?
I'll add that the foundation is looking for 10,000 signatures, so we can certainly help them move that needle along.
Thank you.
And it was bigger than basketball, Coach Hutch. I saw some questionable travel arrangements for your team recently as well. So,
well, I just think that we are at a point where the NCAA needs to decide what they are, because they say they're about this, but they're really about money, and they're making money, yet they schlep kids around. And I'm just trying to draw attention to it. I've gotten a lot of people hammering me on Twitter about, our entitlement, but it's not. I think the NCAA needs to start treating everybody the same, whether you're a softball player or whether you're a men's basketball player. We're all the same. And it's, I don't understand why we have to write a letter to ask them to be transparent. That is their job. So I'm all for bringing out all awarenesses and stirring up conversation. We've certainly getting some of that.
Hey, Hutch, this is Susie Merchant. Can you guys hear me okay?
Hi, Coach. Yes.
Hi. I just want to reiterate, Hutch, what you said. I liked your tweet. I'm a Spartan, and I don't usually do that to you Wolverines, but I appreciate what you did there for women and whatnot. But I will say this, we were on a Big Ten conference call, and the head of WBCA, Daniel Donahue, was on, and there is a really big push from the WBCA standpoint to make a push with the NCAA too. And I'm sure your softball group is doing that as well. So I just, I wanted to share that I think the Kaplan report is going to be a big thing in the women's side that's kind of looking at the inequities between men's and women's basketball championships. But like you said, Hutch, at the end of the day, I think that this is like a Band-Aid on a, bigger problem, right? I mean, that was just, we were fortunate enough, and there's some momentum right now nationally with what happened on the women's side, and certainly volleyball had some issues too. So we're trying to do what we can on our campus, but this task force is really exciting because I think it, we can all work together to help each other and make a difference in our sports.
Well,
So
and
I just wanted to say thanks for sharing that, Hutch. That was big.
Well, it really comes down to the NCAA is nothing but all the institutions that are members. That's who the NCAA is. Every member institution, and the inequities exist on all the campuses, and then they certainly show up on the biggest stage. But we have to sift through the fact that on every college campus, women are highly underrepresented, and the attention paid to our successes is less than the men's. And it isn't just about men and women. It's about Olympic sports and of course revenue sports. But again, revenue sports are, even if they don't make revenue, are treated at a different level. And it's.
Well, I don't know if you. I don't know, Hutch. Did you see, and anyone on the task force? But the WBCA is doing this thing called Our Fair Shot. It's a hashtag, and if you want to check that out, they actually show kind of side-by-side comparisons between men's and women's tournament, from sponsorships to marketing to facilities. And again, it's hashtag Our Fair Shot, and it's got some really good telling information just out of the gates. If people want to be interested in taking a look at that, it's certainly out there. And that's going to be sort of what stemmed the report for the Kaplan and all of that group.
I have a quick question. This is Ramona. So, with everything going on and trying to have debates about this, there are a lot of people that believe that this comes down to economics, and people are watching more of the men's tournament on TV. So what are your responses to that in terms of trying to explain that there should be equity between our men's and women's, especially in the NCAA? Because that's what a lot of people are believing. Those are a lot of the conversations that I've been having, and talking about this situation, and these disparities among women. And, and a lot of men are believing that's the reason why nobody watched women's sports. That's what they're saying.
Right. Well, women's softball is going to be on ABC on Saturday. The first time ever we've been on one of the big networks, the Oklahoma-Washington game. Unfortunately, it's not us. What the investment made at all levels, the investments made in marketing the women and getting us out there. I mean, this is the 44th women's softball team at Michigan, and baseball's at number 158. So they've got a lot of years ahead of us. But it's arguable that they haven't invested in women's sports, and that you can make money on women's sports. And one of the articles that I actually sent to Michelle, there were several articles I've been involved in. It was in the Wall Street Journal back in late August. And it was myself interviewed with two economic geniuses from a couple different college campuses, in talking about exactly women's athletics and the economics of it all, and how, for instance, in the NCAA basketball tournament, when Juwan Howard went to the tournament, for every game they won, Michigan got $1 million. When Kim Barnes-Rico took her basketball team, our women's basketball coach, to the tournament, for every tournament game they won, we didn't get anything. Why is that? The NCAA is making billions of dollars on that tournament. What is with that? So there's a lot of unnoticed things, because the NCAA isn't transparent in their bookkeeping, apparently. So there's a lot of things to dig up there, and I'm not an expert in economics, but I do know that at Michigan, we will sell out every home softball game in a non-pandemic year, and baseball does not come close.
Right. So there's transparency.
Huge. So for all the people who say women don't care about sports, I know millions of people that care about women's athletics. Or people don't care about women's athletics. It's not true. But are we getting us out there on the biggest stage?
And also, I think we should fold this into maybe some of the truth telling around the popularity of women's sports. Maybe I think there's a way for perhaps universities in Michigan to lead in disclosing that information and in sharing that information. Even if it's just Michigan State and Wayne State talking about that and also being, so I think we should also work this into our solutions conversation on the college and athletic or college university conversation about, or just in everyone about how to redefine and all of you here are much better, more experts in this than I am, but just how we tell the story of the popularity and strength of women's sports beyond the benefits of it, societal and otherwise, but the actual financial incentives as well. Or I don't know how to frame it, but you all see what I'm saying. What if we just figure out, maybe it's Dr. Gold, maybe it's your, what you do at Michigan State, but how can we encourage, maybe it gets into the report card discussions as well, but just, more of a public awareness about the truth behind women's sports, the economics of it, the impact of it, the revenue generating aspects of it, all those things.
Yeah, in fact, I don't have a source for this, but I saw a newscast and they had a Washington Post reporter, I think, talking about the NCAA basketball tournament. And I think they demonstrated the women's tournament is financially successful. The men is more successful, but when people say, well, the women aren't making money, it's one of the more successful championships they have when you consider all of them. So the idea that you wouldn't have money to do a weight facility is crazy. But as Ramona says, people don't hear that. Mm-hmm. The men make all the money, the women are dragging it down. So I think the truth telling part's really important. I don't know, Sarah, if you have that somewhere, the foundation, but I thought that was really interesting.
I think it's a few things. I think one of the things that's coming up through this Kaplan review, so Kaplan is the law firm that's doing the review for the NCAA. One of the things that seems to be coming to light is also just the accounting and how the finances are tracked for the NCAA, and that there are some articles that are detailing that it's the women's basketball gets a portion of the corporate champions program. So it's also a little bit unclear how much we're actually tracking the actual, revenue and expenses of women's sports as much as perhaps they could be. And I just put a link in the chat to a Wall Street Journal article, Washington Post, from Sally Jenkins about the corporate champions program from the NCAA. And that just gives some details in terms of how the sponsorships are sold and some of that, which I think sheds a little bit more light on things as well. So, but regardless, right, is also the fact that the NCAA has gender equity as one of their pillars of the work that they do, and that they believe in gender equity. And so whether or not Title IX applies, right, that's almost not the point of the conversation. The point is they value gender equity and they're putting gender equity front and center. And so we want to make sure that, equality is not the same as equity. And so the men might be on a different scale because they have more years ahead of us, right? Just as Hutch was saying, but that doesn't mean that, women should be getting dramatically less, right? Like we can still have equity even if there are differences because of the scale of the tournaments and things like that.
The only other thing, as it relates to this topic, I think, and I've shared some thoughts with the law firm directly, but I think that if we raise these issues, if we have the solution-oriented focus, that is really important. And just from a perspective of kids, I have 3 kids, girls and boys both. And I will tell you, and they're, obviously follow sports, particularly my youngest son, who's in 7th grade. So he's 12 and he is a junkie. And I said, Eli, why don't you watch, or, he'll watch anything. I mean, he was like, Mom, Hutch looks really mad right now. He's watching Michigan softball. He watches anything. And I said, well, why, what do you think about women's basketball? When that all came up, there obviously is a huge topic in my household because they understand, kind of the issues. And he said to me, well, Mom, I'd watch it more if it was on TV. And then I can't follow it on my ESPN app. I said, what do you mean, Eli? And he said, look. And so he pulls up the ESPN app And I never knew this. So when you click on a game, you click on a men's game, a men's basketball game, for example, any level, football, I mean, college and pro, you'll see the Michigan Wolverines, and you can see all the kids on the roster, and they're all hyperlinked. So Joe Smith, you can click on his name and his picture appears and all of his stats appear. And then you can actually follow Joe. So Joe, every time he scores, you get a notice, whatever. And that's how the men's game is set up on the ESPN app. When you go watch the women's game, and he was like showing me, Mom, look, I'm watching UConn game. You click down you go down the roster on the UConn women, and not one of them is hyperlinked. So basic fundamental things of how we promote and broadcast the game to the next generation of kids is just disparate. You know, that's like elementary, you know, media relations reporting stuff. But that's how people start. That's how you're going to get that next generation following them. So I think just some examples to show and solutions, like to me, that can't be that hard. You know, that's just a link to. So, I mean, it's just interesting to hear a different generation's perspective on how they follow sports. And their generation is less men, women. I mean, they'll follow anything. They love great sports. So, but it's interesting how much harder it is to follow women's sports, even for a young boy. So I just share that as an example of, like, you know, if we are going to bring this up, as many solutions as we can give them. Hey, get with ESPN. They're a national partner for you guys. We expect this, and those sorts of things. I think are elementary, basic stuff that we can fix.
Is there a, yes, I agree. And I actually am thinking about maybe what more Michigan can do, our universities can do to promote the stories of women athletes in our state. Because we know that, whether it's just tracking stats or tracking their stories and their, the fact that we had a woman, drafted in the WNBA second round and that barely made a blip on the screen and all of that. I mean, you all know all the specifics. So I think the marketing aspect of it should be a component of our conversations and our solutions and our recommendations that perhaps the state can invest in. On the letter itself, is there if we want to just vote by acclamation, unless anyone makes a motion for a poll vote, or where we'd actually submit votes, or we could just do a voice vote. Is everyone okay with the voice vote, or any objections to it? Okay, all in favor of the task force signing the letter? Aye.
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 Any opposed?
Aye.
Thanks, Joanne. All right, thanks, guys. We'll sign the letter and go from there. Thank you, Sarah. And we have one other individual for public comments who is, I've put down, here's my phone. Put down my phone. We have, goodness,
Elena Glass.
Thank you. Alana Glass, from the Director of Project Play, Southeast Michigan, has signed up for public comment. And so Alana, if you would like to, or Sarah, if you want to give Alana the floor so that she can address the task force. Hi.
Hello, good morning, Secretary Benson and Dr. Watts. Thank you so much for the opportunity to participate in the public comment section. I recognize that I'm the last person on the agenda and largely standing between the group, having perhaps those on the East Coast their lunch break. So I will be very brief. I wanted to just take a moment to introduce myself. I am the new director of Project Play Southeast Michigan. I joined Project Play last October and participated virtually as a viewer in your December meeting, but wanted to take a moment to allow a name and face to be put together. I am just so honored, and so just this conversation that you've had this morning has been just so robust. And I am the product of having strong coaches and being the opportunity to play sport. I grew up in the area, went to the Roper School, then went on to the University of Minnesota, where I was a student manager and walk-on to the women's basketball team. And from there, I then went to law school, and I've largely been in law school administration, but on the side, sports writing and covering girls and women in sports for Forbes, where I've spoken in Dr. Watts's sports courses and have shared my journey as someone who saw the gap in the need for coverage of girls and women in sports, and really took it on. And I just love the conversation again this morning about the coverage. Just seeing the news these last couple of weeks with Cass Tech and its girls lacrosse team. What does that mean when we powerfully show what girls and women can do? And you're absolutely right. There is a need for that. So Project Play is all about access and having kids having access to sport. Looking forward to lending any type of support as the task force moves forward this next year and into the celebration of Title IX, and any support that's needed as it relates to the K through 12 space. We are definitely willing to lend our voice and support. So again, thank you so much, and look forward to staying in touch with the task force.
Thank you, and would love to have you there in the fall for our fall meeting that will be open, and folks will be able to be a part of that. So we'll hope to have your voice at the table then too. Thank you, and unless I hear otherwise, Sarah, with regards to anyone else for public comment, it doesn't look like it. And so we are now, we've reached the end of our agenda. We're going to see you all again in person this fall, which I'm really looking forward to, and to continue the robustness of this conversation then in person. And with all of you and our advisory board members, we can work with you to make sure you're able to attend as well in person. I think this is be the culmination of our work and really set us on our final few months as we finalize everything for the final recommendations to the governor. And from there, please feel free to reach out to Dr. Watts or I between now and then. Of course, you'll also hear from her and Jeanette about the concentrated conversations that we'll be hosting on the specific solutions that we can generate in the various areas. I know we've already got a bunch in the hopper. And again, we'll begin the fall meeting presenting on those to begin the baseline for our discussion for the rest of the day in our next meeting. So with that, thank you all for joining us today. Is there a motion to adjourn? I see a few. Okay. Is there a second? I think we need a second.
Second.
All right. Thanks, guys. Great discussion. Great to have so many of you here today. We have really a full house of our advisors and task force members. So thank you. We are adjourned, and I look forward to seeing you all in person very soon. Bye, guys. Have a great weekend.